Hi guys, welcome to this video all about giving students that are studying A-level English Literature B top tips from an examiner. So I have been examining now Literature B since 2019, and I thought that I would create a video to give you some of the information that I think you should know if you're going to be able to write a good essay for any text for English Literature B for your A-level. None of the information I'm going to give you is information that is top secret for the exam board. This is information that teachers have access to, and it's also my experience. So it's what I've picked up over the years, being not only a teacher of this course but also an examiner in the summer. I want to make it clear that AQA is not paying me for this video. This video is purely my own experiences, and I'm an examiner. I am not a question writer, so I'm not going to be able to tell you what is going to come up as the question papers in the summer, because I don't write the questions. I simply mark what students have written in their exams. So the aim of this video is to give you 15 top tips to help you succeed in English Literature B. So before I start to give you those tips, let me just give you a quick introduction as to who I am. So at the moment I'm subject lead for English, and I've been teaching Literature Spec B since the specification began in 2015, and I've also been an examiner for the course since 2019. Nothing has changed with this course in the last 10 years, so it's relatively identical to the first day that I began teaching it. In that time, my students have been very successful. So in 10 years, all of my students have passed. So I have a 100% pass rate. And last year, 70% of my students achieved an A-star in their coursework. So again, well done to them. So the assumption that I'm making, and the assumption that your teachers make when you decide to do English literature at A-level, regardless of the specification, is that you like reading and you like talking about literature and books, and that you also don't mind writing essays, because fundamentally, of course, reading and writing is what this course is. The reason I'm telling you this is because I want you to see me as somebody in a position of credibility. This is not somebody that's been teaching this course for 5 minutes and then decides to make a video about it. This video is a result of 10 years of work with this specification and with the exam board. englishwithmatt6@gmail.com is my email. Please feel free to email me if you would like any more information, or if you would like to clarify anything in this video. So I'm hoping that you see that I am somebody that kind of knows one end of the mark scheme from the other. I know the specification because it's been my job essentially, or part of my job essentially, for the last decade. So all of these tips I'm giving you in this video are to do with that experience of teaching my own students, but also examining in the summer. I could be, for example, if you're watching this video and you're studying English Lit B, I could be your examiner for one of your papers. So of course we won't know the names of the students, and you won't know who the examiner is, but I am an examiner in the summer. So tip 1. Fundamentally and crucially, students are supposed to enjoy discussing literature. You are seeing your essay or essays as a discussion with the examiner about a particular text and about a particular question related to that text. You've studied these texts for 2 years, and hopefully you've enjoyed them, or at least some of them, and you've also enjoyed being in a room with other people that have the same interests as you in terms of reading and discussing literature. As an examiner, myself and my colleagues at the exam board are genuinely interested in your ideas and interpretations. In other words, this is your exam. We want to know what you think about a particular theme in relation to an aspect of the text. So one of the things that just is a clue really as to the level of confidence that a student has with their literature essays are using words or phrases like of course, or significantly, crucially, or ultimately, because when students start to use that kind of language, it means that they are speaking from this position of confidence. They know the answer to the question, they know what they're going to say, they know their text, and they're ready and willing to engage in a perceptive and confident discussion with the examiner. So my first tip is to perhaps use those phrases at the bottom, but also to see the exam as an opportunity to discuss what you've been studying and hopefully enjoyed for 2 years. Second tip is, again, from both being a teacher of this course but also an examiner. Students must read the question multiple times because it's surprisingly easy, even with relatively short questions, as for example in the William Blake example on this screen, for students to misinterpret the task. So a key piece of advice from me is to circle the key words, as I've done here, in the question, and to keep referring to those words throughout your answer to show the examiner that you are on track. It's very easy with English to go off on a tangent. And as soon as you go off on a tangent, those marks will stop flowing to you. So you have to make sure that you continue to speak about what you've been asked. I'll come back to this idea of answering the question in a second. So try not to misinterpret the task. And one of the ways around this, of course, is to give yourself a very short, concise plan, where all of your plans and all of your bullet points and everything you want to say is linked, crucially, to the task that you have been asked. So to give you an example, last year, the question for Blake's poetry was about authority figures, which means mothers, fathers, parents, guardians, individuals. But many students actually ended up talking about institutions such as the church, the education system. And when they did that, they were not answering the question. So it's really important that you figure out as quickly as possible what it is you're actually talking about. Tip 3 is to, when you're beginning to answer the task in clear English. Write clearly and coherently. Yes, you're doing quite complex exams, and chances are you've never sat an exam as complex as this for literature. But examiners are not expecting students to swallow a thesaurus and develop an overcomplicated style, which actually begins to be unclear. And in effect, what happens is students really are trying too hard. Because when you start to write like on the left-hand side example here, it actually becomes unclear. And it's far better to be clear and get those marks in for that confidence rather than to adopt a very over-the-top style. So if I just pick a sentence here on the left-hand side, this is about a doll's house. The vivacious rapidity of Nora's exodus succeeding her anagnoresis at the expiration of the dramatic construction makes it discernible that rebellion is a foremost leitmotif. I read this and I'm thinking, you're trying too hard. You're trying too hard to sound academic. But what's happening is you're focusing on that rather than really being clear. So the third tip that I would give you from an examiner is to always write clearly. You're not expected to write in a complicated style. Tip 4 is probably the most important tip I'm going to give you in this whole video. And it's a fundamental principle for AQA Literature B, and it always has been, which is that students must answer the question. I've got a 12th night example here for the comedy paper. You can see again I've circled the key foci in this question about misbehaviour and trickery, and about the impact that has for audiences in the sense that they might find it great fun to watch. That is the focus of the task. So in this case, students cannot talk about any other comedic aspect other than misbehaviour and trickery. For example, you can't talk about, marriage, for example, unless the misbehaviour and trickery is to do with a marriage. You can't say to the examiner, well, yes, misbehaviour and trickery might be important, but I would actually prefer to talk about something else with you, because they'll say, well, I haven't asked that, so please stick to the task. So each question, regardless of the text and regardless of the module, whether it's comedy or tragedy or crime writing or political and social protest, will have specific foci in the question. You've really got to make sure you answer that question. This is not a case of listing everything you know about the text. It's also not a case of listing everything you know about the writer. You're not writing here a biography of the writer. So never go off topic. And again, going back to that plan idea, if students write a concise plan thoroughly linked to the task, chances are they will stay on task. As soon as you go off topic and start talking about something other than the focus of the question, you're going to not you're going to start to put your marks at risk. And examiners, unfortunately, were trained to be quite ruthless. If you're not answering the question, even if what you're saying is correct, we cannot credit it. So you must answer the question, okay? Again, to give you some examples, let's talk here about the comedy paper. And we're talking here about section C. And on the left-hand side, we have an example of a student that is using the character of Algernon Moncrief from The Importance of Being Earnest to answer a task about male characters. No surprise, Algie is a male character. And the student is also talking here about the character being a figure of fun. Therefore, clearly, they are answering the question, but they're doing so in a confident and assured manner. So they're getting towards the top of the mark scheme. Notice underneath they also give you a little follow-up task, and I've circled the phrase in relation to some of the male characters. The issue with the example on the right-hand side is whereas they've started by mentioning male characters, this is a student that's then said, well, actually, I'd prefer to talk about Lady Bracknell. And Lady Bracknell is not a man. And nowhere in the mark scheme for this paper does it say anything about women. So as soon as they start talking about women, they're not going to get any marks. Even though what this student says about Lady Bracknell is correct and perfectly written, it's not going to get any marks because they're not answering the question. So you have to make sure that you are clear as to what exactly your answer should be about. Okay, so do not go off on a tangent. Stick to the question that's asked. Fundamental principle for AQA Lit B. Tip 5 is all to do with quoting. Now, the examiners and teachers are not told that students have to have a minimum number of references to the text. Some essays will have 2 quotes, some essays will have 10. I've seen Band 5 essays with 2 quotes, I've seen Band 5 essays with 10. So just because you've quoted doesn't mean you're going to get marks for it. It's how you use those quotes. If you think about it, when you're making references to other writers, it's not your work. Effectively, you're copying somebody else's work in your essay. But you've got to ask yourself the question, why am I doing this? Why am I going to the effort of memorizing this quote that somebody else has written? And why am I going to the effort of putting it word for word in my essay? This is supposed to be my essay, my voice. Why am I therefore copying other people's work? And the reason you're doing that is because you're referencing, because the anticipation that the examiner has is that you're going to talk about the reference afterwards. So the reason why you're quoting, for example, this simile is because that simile has words in it that you're then going to analyse after you've quoted. So this is not a case of just plonking a reference in because you know it's in the text and you know it. It's how you engage with those references. And that is a perceptive skill. And it would also link very nicely to AO2, which is authorial methods or dramatic methods. What is the interpretation you have based on that reference? So just quoting a phrase or a word is not the end of the issue. The issue is, how are you going to talk about that word or phrase afterwards? And how does the analysis of that word or phrase help you answer the question? Okay. With open book exams, of course, students can quote more liberally or more frequently because the text is there with you. In closed book exams, you can perhaps make more references and perhaps summarise in your own words what's going on. But if you do quote in an open or closed book exam, I would definitely say students need to quote references shorter than 10 words, ideally less than 5. This is not a copying activity. And if students spend a paragraph writing out a passage from an extract or a novel, you're not going to get any marks from that because it's not your work. It's how are you using that reference to then discuss the question. Okay, so when you do quote, keep them short and concise. To give you some examples, this is a question that came up a few years ago now for the comedy paper for AS students about Wise Children by Angela Carter. This was a nice question. I like this one. All about the significance of places in the novel. And of course, with comedy, why that might be important in terms of the comedy that's created, that because of things that take place in that particular location. So we have 3 extracts here from 3 different students, and the task that I would ask you to complete at this point would be, which of these students, A, B or C, do you think would get the highest mark if the question is about places and if we're talking about references to the text. So you can pause this video now and think about it, or you can continue watching and I can go through the answers. So the best answer is answer A here. Of course, this is not the whole response, but if they were to continue writing in this style, they would do very well indeed. So firstly, they answer the question, which is the big tick. And the second thing is when they have quoted that phrase paper moon, which is quite important in that novel to do with illusion and the power of theatre really in performance. They've then, after they've quoted that reference paper moon, is they've talked about it afterwards, about the imaginative power of stagecraft and theatre. The least successful answer in this selection is student B. Firstly, they don't answer the questions. That's the first mistake. They have said, even though I know settings are important, I'd rather talk about something else. And they go on to talk about a character, Melchior. So they're not answering the question. So that would get you nothing. That whole paragraph would get you nothing, even though it's correct in terms of what they're saying about the text. They also reference the cardboard crown that Melchior has, which is a motif throughout that novel to do with flawed power and flawed masculinity. But they don't really talk about, the connotations of cardboard. They don't talk about the connotations of the crown. It's almost like an oxymoron there. So there's an opportunity there to miss talking about authorial methods. And student C here kind of sits in the middle. They do talk about settings, which is great, but unfortunately they don't talk about methods. So they quote Old Father Thames, but that is significant in the novel because this novel is very much to do with paternity and fatherhood. And they also quote the word 49 Bard Road, or the phrase 49 Bard Road, where Dora and Nora live. Again, they could actually think about the connotations of the word bard here, because bard links to the world of literature. They also quote the word party, which again is unnecessary because it's a regular word. It's just them trying to fill their essay with quotes because they think they should. So you're not going to get marks for quoting in itself. It's how you engage and discuss those methods afterwards. Okay, so just because you put 20 quotes in your essay doesn't mean you're going to get 20 marks. Okay, it's how you use those references to support your own interpretations. Tip number 6 is to do with the way you begin and end your essays. So I want to talk about section A first. So section A for literature B is going to be an extract question, whether that's tragedy or comedy or crime writing or political social protest. The only essays that need introductions is section A, because AQA insist, and I want to make it very clear, they insist that students need to begin their writing with some kind of overview of what is going on in an extract. So what is happening, place in the plot, beginning, middle and end, climax, setting, time, all of these kind of general contextualization points of the extract to help you then go further and probe the extract in a more active way after the overview. So section A is the only essays where you need to write some form of introductory overview. But for section B and section C questions, of course, this is for A level, not for AS. You don't need to write an introduction. And time again each year, I see students that have spent maybe 10 minutes writing an introduction, but it rarely gets any marks because they're just generalizing, they're just making generalized comments. Who wrote Hamlet? Who wrote this text? Who wrote this poem? You don't need to tell me who wrote it because it's common knowledge. I know that already. So introductions can be time wasters. So for section B and section C essays, it's far better to go straight into a discussion about the first text in relation to the task that you're given. Same thing with conclusions. I do not expect students to write conclusions because these are 45 to 60-minute essays. They're not 10,000 word master's theses. So for a length of task like that, where you've got tens of thousands of words, you probably do need an introduction. You probably do need a conclusion because it's quite a hefty piece of work. But for an essay that's 45 to 60 minutes long, and students usually write about 3 sides in that time, you don't need to write a conclusion, because when students write a conclusion, essentially what they're doing is they just repeat themselves. and you're not going to get marks for the same idea twice. So it's far better to spend the 10 minutes that students write an introduction and the 5 minutes that students take to write a conclusion, to spend those 15 minutes talking about the text some more, rather than trying to create this more traditional essay plan. So unless it's section A, students do not need to write introductions or conclusions. To give you an example, here we have a question which was to do with section B of the comedy paper for paper 1, talking about the taming of the shrew. And it's all about Kate's transformation at the end and whether or not it's uplifting for audiences. We've got 2 examples here of introductions. On the left is how not to do it. This is just a factual recall exercise for this student, and it gets them no marks because it's not answering the question and it's wasting time. For example, yes, the play has 14 scenes, but what does that have to do with the question here? The play focuses on marriage and money, but what does that have to do with the question here? Some of the audiences might find the end of the play controversial and misogynistic. True, but what does that have to do with the question about Kate? So resist the temptation just to give a general overview. You're not going to get any marks for this kind of start of an essay. Instead, what they need to be doing is going straight to the right-hand side example here and going straight into the end of the play and talking about the play and analysing the play in relation to the question. And you can see in this example, they go straight to the end, Kate's monologue, which sounds a bit like a sermon, and they begin to analyse the content of that monologue and talk about that in relation to the end of the comedy and whether or not it's ironic or not in terms of has she actually been tamed or not. So yes, an example there to do with introductions. Don't waste time writing long introductions. I actually remember vividly reading a student's work last year in the summer, and their introduction was a whole page, and it must have taken them about 20 minutes. And it got them hardly anything because they weren't talking about the text, they weren't talking about the question. So again, going back to tip 4, always answer the question. We don't need this kind of introductory comments because the examiner already knows it. Okay, because the examiner is probably going to be a teacher like me. So we know these texts. So everything you tell us has to be to do with the question. Moving on, tip 7 has become a noticeable feature of some essays that I mark in the summer, which is what I think is happening is I think that students believe that they have to engage with literary theory in their exams from, for example, the critical anthology. Whereas, of course, students do need to engage with the critical anthology for their coursework because of the nature of that essay, that project. Students do not, in fact, need to refer to literary theory in their exams. What Marxists or feminists think, or what post-colonial theorists or critics think, is often irrelevant to an answer, and it detracts from the student's own ideas. And you can tell in the way that it has been approached, where the student has been taught, because what happens is every paragraph follows the same formula. For example, the last sentence of every paragraph is the student always saying something like, a feminist critic would think, a post-colonial critic would think, an eco-critical theory would think. It doesn't really matter what they think. I'm not interested in what they think. I'm interested in what you think as the student, because it's your work that I'm crediting. So I would not encourage students, I never have done with my students, to engage with the critical anthology or theory. It can often be a distraction, and it's often not used very well in essays because students rarely will use it in a perceptive, confident way. And I cannot think, as I'm recording this video now, of seeing any Band 4 or Band 5 essay which actually uses Marxism or feminism or any of the other theories. So do yourself a favour. Don't think about it. Don't engage with it. It's far better to be in charge of your own essay and, say what you think, not trying to link to all of these other people. Okay. Yes, AO4 says to make connections, and AO3 and AO4 mentions theory, and AO5 mentions interpretations over time. But you can get those anyway without referring to theory. Okay, so like I said, it often becomes a problem because students don't really know how to use it effectively. You're not going to get any marks by just mentioning theory. It's how that theory enhances your own idea. Just plonking it in an essay is not going to be enough. Okay. Tip 8 is very similar to tip 7 in the sense that don't include critics. So again, something that I have seen recently is that students have been told in order to hit AO5, which is to do with interpretations over time, that you have to include in your essay references to what other people think. And students don't have to do this. And in fact, I would much rather students think about their own references to the text rather than spending large amounts of time memorizing word for word what Joe Bloggs and Sally Ann think of the text. It's often not important to your interpretation. So Heather Jones, for example, who allegedly said feminists are interested in the experiences of female characters. Well, good for her, she said that. But what does that have to do with your answer? How are you using that theory to refine your own ideas? So it's not a case of just putting it in the essay, because like I say, you're not going to get marks for just putting them in. It has to link to the question and your own interpretation. So tip 8 is don't include references to critics. Tip 9, of course, this should be obvious. This is why A-levels are 2 years, to give you enough time to know the text. You have to know the text very well by the time that you sit those exams, because examiners can tell when students have a tentative relationship with the text. They might have a very simple knowledge of the text. They might stay around kind of band 2, which is kind of generalized work. You wouldn't, for example, try and make a birthday cake with half the ingredients. You wouldn't try and make a curry with half the ingredients. So why would you try and sit an A-level exam on a book of which you don't really know very well, or which you've only read in part? So do yourself a favour. Unfortunately, you're not going to wake up one morning and have absorbed a Shakespeare play. You've got to spend the time reading it. There's no other way about it. Okay. Yeah, you might watch the film, but the film might make changes to it. So reading the text is what you've got to do, and reading the text at least twice. There are YouTube videos out there from past students that have said that before their English Lit exams, they read the text 6 times, and they got an A star. So clearly, there's a direct link between reading the text and knowing the text and performing well. If you're going to that exam going, fingers crossed, I get asked about the bit of the text I've read, you're taking a big gamble, and chances are you're not going to be very lucky. So you've got to spend the time before those exams reading the text. There's no other way to put it, I'm afraid. Okay, so knowing the text well is going to be very beneficial. Tip 10, I know I've spoken about the assessment objectives in this video, but that's because I'm doing this from an examiner's perspective. For my students, I wouldn't expect them to be worrying or thinking about the AOs at all in those exams, because it's the examiner's job to find how the students' work comes under the AOs. In other words, I would not want students in that exam to go, as they're writing an essay, oh, I better stop what I'm saying to include some AO3. Oh, I better stop what I'm saying because I must include a technique for AO1. It's not supposed to be like that. So the AOs will actually be automatic. You will get them, the examiner will find them, but don't go into that exam shoehorning those AOs into your essay, because literature doesn't work like that, okay? And it becomes very formulaic. So don't write simply to please the AOs. They are holistic and they are automatic. You're not to worry about them as a student. It's for the examiners to worry about them to give you your marks, okay? And I can't stress that enough. What you write will be in these AOs. You don't have to think about them though, okay? You need to be thinking about the text and the question and what you're going to say in your answer. Tip 11 is don't link to other texts. So don't link to critics, don't link to theory, and don't link to other texts. Often what students will do, and to be honest with you, it always tends to be students that are around kind of band 2, band 3, will tell me about Macbeth because they studied Macbeth at GCSE. The question isn't about Macbeth, the question might be about Othello. Again, in the second example there, the kite runner for political and social protest. The student might link to The Handmaid's Tale. Rarely do links to other texts work very well. And what the student thinks, I think, is that if I give the impression I'm well read, I'm going to get some marks. Not the case. It's, again, if you're going to make links to other texts, why? And of course, in Literature Spec B, this is not a comparative spec, so you're not expected to make comparisons. You're not synthesizing texts together. You're not comparing or contrasting, which is, I think, a good thing, because it means you can actually write some relatively simple essays in terms of their structures, very blocky. Each paragraph has a specific text in mind. So in my experience, it tends to be weaker students or students that get lower marks because they have linked to another text. That, of course, detracts from the question, which is asking you about a completely different text that you've done for A-level. So don't link to other texts, even if it's part of your A-level. So I, for example, teach Taming of the Shrew, and I also teach the importance of being earnest. I would not want students in their earnest essay to reference Shrew or vice versa, because it detracts from the focus of that task. Tip 12 is, in English, there's no such thing as perfectionism, because it's an art, it's ambiguous, and it's based on interpretation. And given the chance, I could give students 3 months to write an essay, for example, and they would keep changing it, keep tweaking it, because there's never a point when an essay can be finished, except, of course, in an exam when the clock runs out and the invigilator takes your exam paper away. That's when it finishes. But just because they've taken that exam paper away doesn't mean further changes couldn't have been made to that task. Of course, there could have been. So sometimes what I've found is that when students set the incredibly high standard, which is, I expect no less from myself, I'm going to write a perfect essay, often because of the nature of what English is, they don't feel like they've done that afterwards. And what happens is they beat themselves up about it because they've set themselves this very high standard. It's far better to go into that exam saying, I'm going to try my best. What I'm going to write is hopefully going to be good. Once the exam is done, I'm going to forget about it. There's nothing more I can do. And I've seen students that are very much paralysed by perfectionism. They doubt their abilities so much that they don't actually write very much. And as a result of that, they get very low marks because there's nothing there. So you've got to have a go. You've got to be courageous. You've got to be brave. You've got to put pen to paper, knowing that this might not be the most perfect essay in the world, but it probably won't be. You've only got 45 minutes to an hour on it. Of course, we'd all like more time, but that's unfortunately not the reality. Okay, so don't strive for a perfect essay and give yourself a break. You know, what you're doing here is not easy. So celebrate what you have done, not what you haven't done. It's always interesting to me when I see students after an exam, the first thing they'll tell you is what they've done wrong or what they've forgotten. They won't actually tell you what they did right or what they did well. I suppose as a society in the UK, we're quite pessimistic. Maybe it's something relatively British, I don't know. But celebrate what you have done, not what you haven't. Tip 13 is don't rely on writing frames. These might be useful to get students going in the very early stages of the year, or year 12 or the AS year. But actually over time they become very restrictive, because A-level English works best, at least for Spec B, when students have the freedom to analyse at their leisure and to make their own judgments about significance, and to use the text in a way that they want to use it, not being restricted by a formulaic paragraph approach. Again, the problem with this is every paragraph sounds the same, and it detracts away from the student's own individuality in terms of their voice in their essays. So what students will do is, oh, I've got to include some context now, or I've got to include some analysis now, I've got to include a technique now. And it's very kind of factory line orientated. And to be honest with you, they're not the most brilliant essays to read. They're relatively grey or beige if they were a colour. What you'll notice is the most confident students are the ones that have the freedom. So I have always given my students the freedom to analyse a text and answer a question in the way that they see fit. And it always works for me. They've always got that skill by the end of the year or by the end of their course. So yes, I'm a big fan of giving students freedom. And I also don't like it really when GCSE has formulas. Again, English is supposed to be about expression. We wouldn't tell artists to all paint the same. we wouldn't tell all musicians to play the same instrument. But for some reason in English, we always tell students to answer the question in the same way. And I just don't get it, really. Primary schools are very, obviously, league table, results orientated. But English is supposed to be an expression. It's not supposed to be a formula. That's what makes it different to maths and science. So yes, stay clear or don't rely on writing frames to get you the band 5. Rarely do students get band 5 or 4 with a very formulaic approach. Tip 14 is to comment on methods. This is important. It's mentioned as a separate strand of the question. Dramatic methods there on the left to do with dramas and plays, and authorial methods on the right there to do with prose and poetry. You can see that some are in both, some are just for one, but you must give the examiner the impression that you are going to talk about interpretations. Okay, so these things being used as a tool to make interpretations in the same way that historical context would be a tool to make interpretations. So that links me very neatly onto my final tip, which is all to do with AO3, which is all about social and historical context, but importantly, to limit this. We're doing English, we're not doing history. Yes, undoubtedly, there is a close relationship between history and English, particularly literature, because we're studying, in effect, literary history. But often what I find is students go off on a tangent and they will write about history and historical details, which again detracts from the focus of the task. So here we have a kite runner example, and this is the question that came up a few years ago about masculinity being toxic and all the male characters being vile. And quite rightly, this student talks about SF, and if you've studied the kite runner, I would hope you would understand why they've chosen SF, because he is a great character in this situation to talk about. But on the left-hand side, you can see that the student begins talking about the Taliban, and they give us a good introduction to the Taliban, which is unnecessary. We don't need this information. It's far better to do what the right-hand side example does, which is, yes, to make reference to the Taliban, but to say how the Taliban is important in terms of the interpretation of the character, because that is what the question is asking you about the male characters. So the example on the right there would be much better. They're not getting distracted by telling us about context. And of course, the context has to be relevant to the question or to the extract. So to give you an example with the Taming of the Shrew, one of the contextual factors is that it was very common at the time for parents to hire school tutors for their children, their daughters, because the daughters often left school around the age of 10. And if the parents wanted to continue their child's education, they would have to instruct school tutors. That happens in the play. You have characters in that play that do disguise themselves as tutors. But if those characters are not in the extract, or if those characters are not in the question, then I would not be expecting students to talk about school tutors' context, because it's not relevant. Just because it's true doesn't mean you're going to get marks for it. So it goes back to that point I made at the beginning, which is just because you know it doesn't mean you're going to be able to use it. It has to be relevant to the task, because context, like authorial or dramatic methods, is a tool of interpretation. It's not a standalone thing that's going to get you marks. It's how that context helps you interpret and gauge significance regarding the question and the text. Okay, so stay clear of using lots and lots of context. With Blake, I don't need you to tell me about the revolution of the Industrial Revolution or the French Revolution. I don't need you to tell me, for example, about, John Locke, for example, and what his beliefs were, unless what John Locke's beliefs were links to your interpretation of a particular poem. Okay, with The Handmaid's Tale, I don't need you to tell me what Nicolae Ceausescu did in Romania in the 60s as part of his dictatorship. Just because you know it, it has to be linked to something tyrannical going on in the part of the text you're talking about. Okay, so don't just put context in because you know it. It has to be used sparingly to enhance your interpretation. So those are my 15 tips. Here we are, all in one place. And if students are going to be doing all of this, it's going to push them up the mark scheme. That's based on my experience of teaching this course for 10 years now, and also being an examiner for Literature B for a number of years since 2019. Okay, so maybe that's busted some myths. Maybe there's always a kind of an issue that you've always wondered about. And what I hope to do with this video is to give you the examiner's perspective. At the end of the day, I spend 2 months in the summer reading over 100 scripts a year, trying to find ways to give students their qualification. Examiners don't want to not give you a good mark. We're teachers, we understand how important it is for you, we understand how hard you've worked, we want to give you those marks, trust me, okay, we do. But unfortunately, because of the nature of being an examiner, we can't be unfair, and we can't credit you for things that aren't there or haven't met a particular standard. So we have to be fair, and because examiners are constantly checked by the exam board that we're being fair, we mark in batches of 10, and in each batch of 10 there's a seed essay which the exam board has already marked, and if we're too lenient or if we're too harsh with that essay, we get locked out of the system, and we have to have a discussion with our senior examiner or our team leader. So we have to be fair, and it's on your benefit to be fair, as well as kind of the AQA's, the exam board's benefit as well. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. Hopefully that is useful. Of course, we're coming up to a busy exam period right now, hence why I'm giving you this video now to help make any alterations to your essays that you need to in good time. Drop me an email, like I said, if you want any more, if you have any more questions or want to clarify anything. But hopefully that was useful. All about Literature Spec B and giving an examiner's perspective. None of this is, I'm not getting paid by AQA for this video. This is purely my own experience from being an examiner, based on doing this work now for a number of years. And hopefully it's there to give you some guidance. Okay, so thank you very much for watching, and good luck in your studies.